Okay, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Loren March. My pronouns are they, them. And welcome to Cooperative Housing, Canada's potential for a new era of affordable housing. I'll be moderating tonight's event. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto's Department of Geography and Planning, and I am also the project manager at the Affordable Housing Challenge project at the University of Toronto's School of Cities. I am so excited that we have so many people in attendance tonight. This is a very cool thing. I want to welcome you all to our seminar, and you're going to hear from some very excellent panelists tonight. I expect we're going to have a really great conversation after this. So please stick around towards the end for some more discussion after the initial presentations. For those of you who are just new followers to our work at the Affordable Housing Challenge project, we are an initiative of the School of Cities at University of Toronto. We bring together scholars from across disciplines at the university who are researching issues related to affordable housing affordability, and to support and amplify the work of community organizers, affordable housing activists. Our seminar series in particular seeks to bring some of the topics and discussions that we're having and wrestling with our group to the broader public. So we're really happy to have you all here today. And also many thanks to Sean Grisdale for organizing this event from our team. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that the lands the university exists on and the Affordable Housing Challenge conducts our work on have for thousands of years been the lands of many Indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and continue to be home to many Indigenous and Métis people from across Turtle Island. We are very grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work here. And I do think that today also provides a really interesting opportunity to take time to reflect upon the politics of co-ops and other models of ownership and housing provision in the context of ongoing settler colonialism. And as we are online, we're probably being joined by folks from all over. And I do recommend that everyone take time to figure out whose land you are on. I'm actually going to post something in the chat, just nativeland.ca, in case you don't know. So that's in the chat. Tonight, our topic of discussion is cooperative housing. So Simone is going to start us off by explaining cooperatives and what that is. I won't get into defining that. I will leave that to our presenters. But I will speak a little to what prompted this seminar, which is the fact that where cooperatives are concerned, we sort of find ourselves in a time of transition and opportunity. So for decades, housing co-ops have offered people affordable and stable places to live. And at this time, many co-ops are figuring out how to go forward following the end of operating agreements. Others are facing the ends of mortgages and considering options for how to proceed into the future. And others are figuring out how to develop more cooperative homes. So in Ontario, where we are right now, we haven't seen that much cooperative development over the past 2 decades, but we are seeing with the emergence of programs such as the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, possible renewed interest in supporting this model and new possibilities opening up. So we thought this was a great time to have a conversation about this. We have 3 wonderful speakers joining us to discuss the possible futures of cooperative housing tonight and experiences in cooperative housing. And I want to introduce them. So tonight we are joined by Simone Swail, who is the Manager of Government Relations at the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada. We're also joined by Thom Armstrong, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC. And we also have with us Claire-Hélène Heese-Boutin, who is a Toronto housing advocate and a member of the Dufferin Grove Housing Cooperative. So we are really pleased to have you all joining us tonight. We are going to start with presentations from Simone and then Thom and then Claire, and we will open up the floor for questions after that from our audience members and have a broader discussion. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go, and I will do my best to return to as many of these as possible at the end. So I will not take up any more time. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Simone. Thank you.
All right, well, hopefully the technical difficulties will smooth out from here. Good evening, everybody. I was so excited that so many people have chosen to spend your evening talking about cooperative housing. I think that speaks itself to the potential for a new era for affordable housing and cooperative housing in Canada. So my name is Simone Swail. I'm the Manager of Government Relations for CHF Canada. I work primarily in Ontario. but CHF Canada is a national voice of housing cooperatives. We represent over 2,200 housing co-op homes all across the country. And about 250,000 Canadians call co-op housing home. We have been around for over 50 years, and we provide, co-ops provide good quality, affordable housing owned and managed by the community members who live there. So our members are the nonprofit housing co-ops, as well as the organizations and people who support them. So I thought I would start off this evening with just back to basics. I've been in co-op housing for over 10 years. Lots of people, most people do not know what a housing co-op is. So if we're going to create a new era of co-op housing, we got to start with fundamentals. What are we talking about here? So housing co-ops, they can come in a lot of forms. There are equity and nonprofit housing co-ops. Today, I am, and I believe Thom and Claire are going to be speaking about nonprofit housing co-ops, because those are the types of co-ops that CHF Canada represents. And I think those are the types of co-ops that provide the affordable housing solutions we are looking for. But if you have questions about equity co-ops, maybe Thom or Claire can answer them. We'll see how it goes. So housing co-ops operate in a unique space between renting and home ownership. They are mixed income communities that, because of their inherent and inclusive design, they bring people together from diverse social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. Co-ops can be kind of any size or mixture of housing types, but what brings them together is that they're guided by the international cooperative principles. And that's really what makes a co-op a co-op. And those principles and really what's most important for today is that the sense of open membership, democratic control, and community. In a housing co-op, that means the co-op is jointly owned by the members who live in the co-op, who through a democratic process have a say over decisions that impact the community. The members elect a board of directors, and almost all the co-ops here in Ontario just also hire professional management to manage day-to-day. So that's just a little bit of who we are. Primarily, co-ops right now in Ontario are independent organizations. As I mentioned, they're a mixture of housing types. So you see apartment buildings here in downtown Toronto. You see there's lots of infill. And if you go outside of the city, if you go into smaller communities across the country, they're townhomes. They really do come all shapes and sizes. But what they really are, those vibrant mixed income communities that have diverse and inclusive membership. The range and the depth of incomes that are in co-ops really has depended on when they're developed. So, and if they've accessed government housing programs. So some have a lot of households that are on low incomes, and some just have a few. But co-ops can create that strong sense of community and belonging because they encourage members to learn new skills and to work together to kind of solve that problems. And a program evaluation by CMHC a number of years back found that co-ops, households, and co-ops achieve better indicators in life, such as skill development and labor force participation, as well as having a sense of belonging. And I think that's something that's really important about co-ops, is that they really build a sense where people feel connected to their communities. So what we find is that co-ops are ideal communities for young families to secure a place to live, for low-income seniors who otherwise might face social isolation, and for new Canadians or those living with disabilities to find good quality, affordable housing with a strong supportive community. When I speak to people across the country about what they like about living in their co-op, because not everybody even knows somebody who lives in a co-op, is that it's an affordable home with a real sense of security, where you have ability to say over your community and to be an active and engaged participant, and to have a strong sense of inclusion and belonging. So as everyone who's attending the session, I'm sure knows, we're in the midst of a housing crisis. That's why we're here. We're looking for solutions. That's why. But just to put some concepts behind it, in December, RBC reported that for their measure for housing affordability for homeowners in Canada had reached its worst level in 31 years, with house prices roughly doubling across the country over the last 7 years. For renters, that situation is even more bleak. So here in Toronto, the 20% of lowest income renters can afford only 0.2% of the purpose-built rental housing stock. And part of that problem is that, whereas in the past decades where market rental housing became less expensive over time, becoming a relatively affordable option for many households, that is no longer happening. We're seeing, we've seen very limited private market rental developed over years, and the private market rental that's being developed is not affordable to everyday Canadians, which makes the fact that co-ops become more affordable over time kind of that much more important. When we look at co-ops tracking over time, is they become more and more affordable, not only to low income households, but to middle income households that live in their communities. The market rents become better and better with time. And that co-ops are accountable to the members and communities, and that's really what drives them. So, this is a campaign we ran a few years back, but really speak to housing that's affordable forever. It's not fiction, it's co-op. And I think it's really trying to share that message with more and more people, and why we're so excited so many people came out today. So when we talk about the potential for a new area of affordable housing in Canada, for affordable co-op housing, I think it's important that we also talk about where we are right now and how do we get here. So first off, a brief history of co-op housing in Canada. I'm not going to run through all the way through this, but the highlights are that the first federal program to develop housing co-ops in Canada began in 1973. And there were a series of programs that developed co-ops primarily by the federal government, but also in Ontario, Quebec, and BC. There were also provincial programs. And basically those programs began to end in 1992. In Ontario, they ended in 1995 with new austerity measures. During that period, we built basically 90,000 units of cooperative housing. So in 20 years, basically incredible things were achieved. The co-ops that exist today are largely a product of robust and dedicated federal programs that supported the development of co-op housing, primarily, during that 20-year period. That was the first generation of co-op housing, and it continues to pay dividends in providing security and affordability for the households and communities across the country. When this programs ended in 1995, little co-op housing has been built after us. So whereas in 1982, 8% of all rental homes constructed in Canada were co-ops, totaling over 6,500 homes. In 2020, less than 1% of all rental homes constructed were co-ops. So if we want the security, community, and perpetual affordability that housing co-ops offer as a part of the supply mix that will set us on a pathway out of our housing crisis, we're going to need to build the next generation of co-op housing. And the good news is that we've done it before, and that we can do it again. With some lessons learned, that with the benefit of some hindsight. It also means that we have significant assets that should be able to help play a part and help support that growth. But for this to be successful, we need to ensure that our existing communities are secure. So most of our co-ops were built during that period I mentioned. So they're 22 to 45 years old. Some are older because we converted existing buildings into co-ops, and a very small number are newer. Because housing co-ops are reaching the end of their original mortgages, there's a time of real potential. So depending on the agreements that are struck with the province, municipalities, and federal government, while many of our buildings will need large-scale renewal, there's also potential to add more units to some of these existing buildings. So for co-ops that were developed through funding programs by the federal government, these co-ops are in a relatively good position. The original operating agreements have ended. However, the federal government came through with the National Housing Strategy with a new rental assistance program for approximately, in these co-ops, about 25% of households have a low income and were on rental assistance. That program extends until 2028, though we are looking for further extension. But this has allowed the co-ops themselves to directly fund or take out loans to support the repairs and renewals of these communities. And it leaves these co-ops by and large in a good position to look at growth opportunities. For the municipal provincial co-ops, particularly in Ontario, but also in some other provinces where the responsibility for the co-ops got downloaded, the mortgages are beginning to be paid off, but the rental assistance funding after the mortgage is paid off is not guaranteed. And this directly affects their ability to fund or take out new loans to support repair or renewal. So what are we talking about here? So here in Ontario, There are 250 housing co-ops that are home to 21,000 households. So this is 22% of all co-ops in Canada. On average, in these co-ops, 75% of households are on rental assistance in the form of rent guaranteed income. And that is currently being paid by what's called the service manager, which is this municipality or regional municipality, depending on where you're located. So these co-ops, and it's not just co-ops that are affected by this end of mortgage issue. There's also a very significant portion of other nonprofits or social housing in Ontario that are impacted. When these co-ops reach the end of their mortgage over the next kind of 10 years, they have no guarantees about what's going to happen. So if the current funding formula that's in provincial education continues, their funding will drop dramatically at the end of their mortgage, to the point where they effectively will not receive any funding for rental assistance for those 75% of households that are on subsidy. And so it makes these co-ops, not part of the solution for the future of co-op housing in Canada. It actually puts us at risk of losing a significant portion of our existing stock. So there is, a move right now. The end of mortgage in many ways should actually be an opportunity, like it is for the federal housing co-ops, for these co-ops to reinvest in their renewal, to reinvest in the communities, and potentially to set themselves up for growth. For that to happen, though, the right solution to the end of mortgage issue has to be found, and it needs to be found at a provincial level. So roughly, what's at stake with end of mortgage? Why does it matter? Is roughly $16 billion of funding for affordable housing. Is that's over the stake over the next 40 years in Ontario? There's no guarantee it will be reinvested, but there's the potential to free up millions in the community housing system and to make the co-ops and nonprofits stronger at the other end of it. So the province is aware of this issue, and they've just completed a public consultation on trying to get the public's feedback on what they should do going forward. What we're waiting to see if they will come through with a baseline funding formula for these co-ops and nonprofits after the end of their mortgage that protects the funding for rental assistance. Because the alternative would be to allow each service manager, and there's 47 of them across the province, to find its own solution. And that's a very concerning proposition, because it would further fragment our community housing system all across the province. And it would put a lot of these communities at risk as they come out over the next 10 years to the politics of a given day in a given region. So this is, as I said again, it's absolutely an opportunity to fix our housing system and these housing co-ops in Ontario, but it's that we need to set them up for a positive solution. So in Ontario, again, we've learned from the federal housing co-ops that have had their rental assistance continued, that when you do that, what you allow the co-ops to do is then take care of their assets, their buildings, as a business. You allow them to either fund from themselves or remortgage into the buildings, and to do those repairs in a planned way over the long term, so that these co-ops are available for future generations. So for the potential of building the next era of co-op housing and co-op, notwithstanding that kind of doom and gloom that we may be facing here in Ontario, I think there is reason to be optimistic about the future. And I'm going to let Thom and Claire speak to this kind of more in detail. I'm doom and gloom. But even today in the Globe and Mail, the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, said that the federal government has an important role to play, working with municipalities and provinces in increasing supply, including a mix of rental supply. And I think now is the time for new energy in the building of co-ops. So that's a really exciting thing to hear, because just at a very high level, what's needed for building that next generation of co-ops is a new partnership with government that commits to funding new development. We know from our 50 years of experience that government is investment is needed to develop significant levels of new co-op homes. Otherwise, you end up with small one-offs. And that when that investment died, so did the number of new co-op homes developed. But if we're going to do it again, I think we would learn that the individual co-op model can be fragile. And while our communities do an excellent job with their operations and running their own communities, they're not developers or experts in leveraging their assets. So I want to turn it over to Thom and Claire, who I think are both going to speak about the land trust model. And this is one of these unique opportunities that has a long history in cooperatives. And here in Toronto, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto has had a land trust with over 32 co-ops in it for decades. 4 land trusts, sorry, together. It has 32 co-ops in it. So there are ways I think that we can do things better and that we can learn from this kind of fragmentation that we have in our existing model, and that makes these individual co-ops so vulnerable when things like existing government programs and assistance come up. So with that, I will pass it back to Loren and take it from there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was excellent and very, very informative. A good place to start tonight. I will not take up time. I'm going to pass it right over to Thom. Let me just, yeah, there you are. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm just such a pleasure to be here and to share this time with you and with the panelists. My name is Thom Armstrong. I'm the CEO of the Co-op Housing Federation of BC and the Community Land Trust Foundation. Want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you here today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. CHFBC is committed to a journey of truth and reconciliation that respects the land and its original stewards who were displaced by a calculated strategy of systematic violence and genocide. And we pledge our active support to confront and dismantle the systemic racism those practices, past and present, are based on. So let's get right to it. A new era of affordable housing in Canada. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? But what could it mean, and how might it include co-ops? I've heard some people say over time that co-ops are the best kept secret in the affordable housing community. And why is that? Well, one reason is that there have been very few built since the early 90s. Simone mentioned that. So here's a piece of trivia you can use when we're allowed out to see each other. Again, the last housing minister to launch a unilateral federal co-op housing program in Canada sat at Brian Mulrooney's cabinet table. The last one. I'm willing to bet some of the people joining us today weren't even alive when the last co-op housing program was approved. And now, as Simone mentioned, there are more than 2,000 co-op communities in Canada, more than 90,000 co-op homes, and 250,000 Canadians enjoying the benefits of co-op housing, but most of it built and financed between 1973 and 1992. So it's worth recalling just for a minute what made that possible. And I would point to 2 factors. One, significant government funding, predictable, stable program streams, primarily resourced by the federal government. Secondly, an organized co-op housing sector to champion co-op development. So we still have that organized sector, but only a patchwork of government funding for new development remains. That's a pale reflection of what it used to be. And in the meantime, what else has changed? Well, pretty obviously, housing is more unaffordable than ever. The Canadian Rental Housing Index paints a pretty grim picture. The numbers between BC, where I'm located, and Ontario are very similar. In Ontario, almost half of tenants pay more than 30% of their gross annual income on rent or shelter. 1 in 5 tenant households in BC and Ontario pay more than 50% of their gross income on shelter costs. That is just like one step away, one bad break from homelessness, and not a sustainable housing system. Secondly, it's a whole lot more expensive to build housing today. Land and construction costs through the roof. So the equity gap in your standard pro forma is bigger, and it's more expensive to fill. And that makes governments very nervous about the price tag that comes with bold and innovative housing policies. And of course, to make things worse, existing purpose-built rental housing, especially the most affordable purpose-built rental housing, is under assault from real estate investment trusts and other investors. Indeed, we're losing far more affordable housing than we're building. even where governments are investing in a new supply of affordable housing, and that just promises to make a bad situation even worse. So now it might strike you as odd to hear me say after that I'm optimistic. So why am I optimistic that we can turn this around? I would point to three things. Well, first, the federal government is back at the table. Okay, they're not quite serving up a full meal yet, but at least they're in the kitchen, and that matters. Secondly, municipalities are waking up to the positive role they can play in protecting and developing affordable homes by using their zoning powers and, even more importantly, their assets in land. And thirdly, the sector has more development capacity now than at any point in its history, which means that we can be the engine of our own growth. And that, to me, is the signature change over time that we will find ourselves, if we play our cards right, in a position where we don't have to necessarily wait for a succession of government programs if we learn how to leverage the assets we have and take advantage of the funding that's in place right now. Later, in fact, this week, could be as early as tomorrow, we expect our National Federation, CHF Canada, to unveil a bold proposal to build the next generation of cooperative housing. I hope we're talking about new supply, infill and redevelopment, acquisition of existing properties for conversion to co-ops. All of that matters. We hope the federal government will be listening. So, some people might be tempted to ask, is this even like realistic? Could a community-based housing sector like the co-op sector be the engine of its own growth? And I say yes, it sure is realistic. In BC, we've spent the last 7 years using our community land trust to mobilize social purpose real estate and development capacity to do 5 things. First, build new co-op and nonprofit homes, plenty of them. Secondly, save distressed assets from being lost to the sector and rebuild co-op communities in difficulty in the process. Third, redeveloping existing homes and adding more homes. This is the happy marriage between housing economics and a housing crisis. If you're going to redevelop an existing community, you need to add significantly more density in almost every case to the community in order to make the numbers pencil out at the bottom of the pro forma, thereby providing more affordable homes for people who really need them. In the process, we're building partnerships to house people in marginalized communities who haven't had access to, on an equal basis, to the housing market. And finally, and again, significantly, we're partnering with municipalities who have land, but not development capacity, to leverage public land for community housing. In other words, to leverage community assets to produce community wealth. We've developed, we have almost 1,200 occupied homes now in the land trust, another 557 under construction, and just over 1,000 more homes actively under development. I want to acknowledge that the missing piece so far is a strategy for the acquisition of existing purpose-built rental housing. We're working on that. We need patient capital to do that. And sad to say that yesterday our provincial government missed a huge opportunity in the release of its budget to tackle this urgent issue. But the good news is that new community land trusts are springing up all over Canada, especially in Toronto, in neighborhoods like Parkdale and Kensington. If we're smart about it, and if we're determined enough, and we are determined, we can usher in a new era of affordable housing and build the next generation of co-op housing. We can do it by leveraging the assets and the capacity we already have in partnership with new government commitments to build a permanently affordable supply of community-based housing in Canada. CHFBC and the Community Land Trust are all in on this effort, and I hope you will be too. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Thom. That was I love the hopeful note that we ended on, especially there. And I think a lot of people here are probably on the same page with that. I am going to turn it over to Claire now, who is going to sort of bring us home with the, I think, firsthand experience of being a co-op member, as well as a housing advocate. So take it away.
Thank you, Loren. Yeah, and thank you to Thom. I'd love to mention that it was the Vancouver Community Land Trust that really inspired me. It was one of the first CHF Canada AGMs that I attended as a member of a housing co-op, and I saw Tiffany, who's the asset manager for the Vancouver Community Land Trust, talk about what they were doing in Vancouver, and my mind was just completely blown with what was possible. The number of units that they were building the way that they were supporting existing co-ops to deal with properties that were in distress and to make it into homes that people felt really good to be in. It was just super exciting. So Thom is a huge inspiration. So I'm speaking to you all, as Loren mentioned, as a tenant, a resident, a member of the Dufferin Grove Housing Cooperative. I'm also a former board member of the Dufferin Grove Housing Cooperative, a former board member of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, and also a Torontonian, born and raised. And when I think about myself as a Torontonian, I look at my peers and the people that I grew up with, the people I went to university with, and I am an exception. I am one of the only people that I know that has had stable housing for 10 years. I've never faced a rent eviction. I've never faced having to move outside of the city or, out into the burbs. I haven't had to move back home very often. It was actually, I had to move back home and then I found housing in the co-op, and that's never been a situation for me since then. That is, because I couldn't afford my housing. And when I think about my peers, those are the stories that I hear over and over again, is my landlord has given me an eviction notice because they're going to renovate, or because their family is moving in, or I've had to move out of the city, and all of these different stories. And I just want to acknowledge how important it's been in my life to have that stable housing. It's enabled me to take risks in my career and to imagine things that I think some of my peers haven't had that opportunity to do. I also wanted to go back to something Simone had said, and the sense of belonging. Living in a housing co-op, you have a sense of community unlike anything else. We have community dinners, we have social events. I feel really comfortable talking to my neighbors about what's going on in my life, what's up. Them taking care of my cat, me taking care of their animals, watching the kids in the co-op grow. Those are things that are they're very tangible, but so important. So when I think about the new era of housing co-ops, and I think about it as a tenant or a member, a resident, where are my responsibilities? Where does this scale of things lie when we think about growth in the housing co-ops? And for myself, as a member of the Dufferin Grove Housing Cooperative, I've seen what has happened when we leave it to just the members to make decisions about the future of our community. I think there is a real importance for us to start to think about our membership as an opportunity for growth and not just the housing itself. So being a member of the Dufferin Grove community means I'm a member of the CHFT community, which is the Cooperative Housing Federation of Toronto, as well as CHF Canada. And it affords me the ability to have mentorship about what housing is. It affords me the ability to learn about governance. It has so many benefits that I think are valuable to people who are not just members. And when we bring in people from who are not just residents, they have an opportunity to think beyond just the four walls that they live in and the structural integrity or making sure that the air quality is good. They have the ability to think about creating more housing co-ops so that they would be able to live in those as well. My apologies. So I think what I'm trying to say is that for a new era of housing cooperatives, I think it's really important for us to expand our membership as well as expanding our housing itself. And so bringing in people like the More Cooperative Housing Collective. So this is a group in Toronto who started off with members or renters who live next door to the Dufferin Grove Housing Co-op. And they wanted to be part of our co-op, and they really wanted to be part of the community and the sense of community that was there. And so they started to think about, how do we grow the co-op sector? And this was a bit different than what was going on within our co-op, where we were struggling with 10 properties that are over 100 years old, where we have significant capital repairs. And so our ability to feel comfortable with risk and thinking about growth is challenged because we're thinking so much about just being able to keep the four walls around us standing. And I think that there's opportunity to bring those two groups, those people who aspire to be members of co-ops with the existing tenants, to grow and to imagine more of what's possible. Alongside that, we've talked about the community land trust model. And I think that that's another thing that we need to consider as co-op members is, are there governance structures that might be more abundant for us? Ways in which we can shift responsibility to a bigger pool of people who can think about asset management, who can think about growth, who can think about making sure that our buildings are energy efficient, and all of those kind of capital-based questions, so that other members can think about making sure that we have social events, resolving conflicts between members, a lot of those day-to-day operational issues. And so what's the opportunity for us to not just leverage the asset itself, but leverage a new governance structure, which is a community land trust, in order to help us to think bigger and continue to grow. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, just thinking about time and wanting to hear some questions. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire. So we now are going to open the floor to some questions for further discussion. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and we're going to go through those as much as possible and return back to questions that were posted earlier on. So I'm going to just roll back here and ask, okay, so maybe Thom could speak to this, because I think this was mentioned while you were speaking, but maybe others might want to speak to it as well. Knowing the successes in BC, why would all levels of Ontario government not mimic the BC example?
Well, I'm going to do my best not to speak for the Ontario government. But I guess there are two dimensions to the question. Why isn't every provincial government making the kind of investment in new affordable housing supply that is happening in BC? That's a $7 billion commitment over 10 years. They're frustrated with us because we keep telling them it's not enough, but it isn't. So there's that. But I want to flip the question around a little bit and say that it's not up to government to put some of the structures in place that Claire was talking about and that I've been talking about, to reorganize ourselves to generate the capacity for growth within the sector. That's a community land trust or movement, or other arrangements that have the effect of aggregating assets in what's now a very disaggregated asset base. And I would say that's up to us to organize ourselves to be bolder, more proactive, and more self-sustaining over time. And there's no reason we can't do it. In fact, we should do it so that we're not as dependent on government as we have been for the first 4 decades that we've been around.
I will say, just to challenge you on that one point, Thom, there are some structural issues to doing it in Ontario, but that is about how we solve the end of mortgage, and that the legislation around that, half of the co-ops in Ontario is so strict, it really does limit what they can do as far as leveraging their assets, working together with other co-ops. A lot of that is really restricted by that act, but that is the direction that I think a lot of us see is the potential for growth. So I think, to your point, motivating and encouraging government to see that potential is on us as well, to let them see that bigger picture of what they're missing when the micromanaging of the agreements that the co-ops have with government just don't make things possible. Yeah.
I jump in and say, I completely agree, because for many of our co-ops, it's up to us we are in control of the co-op. So if we need to merge, or if we need to use a community land trust model, we as members will need to make that decision to move to those strategies. And that's definitely more possible with the federal co-ops than with the provincially managed co-ops in Ontario. And so there's definitely a lot of that kind of tension there. But there are still opportunities for federal co-ops to come together and to push for change. And I think the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is a great example of what's possible. One of the first projects that the Land Trust took on was addressing rooming houses and the loss of rooming houses within Parkdale. As board members, we knew that this was, not the low-hanging fruit, but the fruit at the top of the tree from an economics and like just a practical sense. It seemed like the hardest thing to do. But with that initiative and energy, we were then able to push the government to create the policies that we needed to make that project happen and to use that momentum to continue to push further as a land trust and to engage large numbers of the community to really push the government to move further. So there's this tension where we absolutely need government to support us, but there's also this responsibility of being able to leverage our assets and also leverage our community and to build that community strength to be able to bring this new era forward.
Thank you for that. Excellent. I like the conversation here. I'm going to go to a question of like definition or explanation of some terms that were used during the conversation. Someone has asked, what do you mean when you say leveraging assets? I think almost everyone mentioned this at different points, so we might be speaking to different specific things, but maybe folks could speak to what that might mean.
I want to throw this one to Thom.
Yeah.
Well, when I use the term, I'm starting from the fact that if you look at the asset base in the co-op housing sector, it's about as disaggregated as you can imagine. I mean, in BC, the average co-op is 52 homes in size, which, if you're looking to create that perfectly supportive, connected community that we talk about as being one of the principal benefits of co-op housing, it's perfect. To use it as a springboard to launch a development or redevelopment project, not so perfect. So we've worked with a number of co-ops that have needed to invest substantially in their buildings. But all they have available to them is the equity on their own balance sheet, and sometimes it's just not enough to secure the financing needed to move forward. But if you're part of a portfolio where that equity and those assets are combined and available to be deployed to meet a wide variety of needs, well, all of a sudden now you've got equity you can borrow against to use in a number of different co-ops. So that's one way that assets can be leveraged to deliver really good outcomes. Another example is assets and land. The city of Vancouver made land available to the Community Land Trust on very long-term leases for very little bit of money. So there's a lot of equity in that land, and that's what we used, to mortgage the leasehold interest to acquire, the financing to build 358 homes across 4 sites that were then, now they're occupied by co-op members paying, in year 1 about 3/4 of the market rent in the surrounding area. So that's another way that can be done. And just in redevelopments, you've got equity again in the land that can be mobilized or deployed to secure the financing to double, or in some cases triple, the number of homes that are on a particular site. So those are the principal ways in which I think of assets being leveraged through a community land trust or any other aggregator who's able to follow that kind of path.
Thank you, Thom. Does anyone else want to speak to that question at all?
No, I just maybe add for some context. So when we speak about that land assets that Thom mentioned, even just in the GTHA back in 2016, and we know how crazy the market's gone since then, there was a study of the federal housing co-ops in that region, and it was found that they had over $400 million worth of basically underutilized land assets, because the way we used to build co-op housing was, with large tracts of land that, now we would never design that community that way. So there are real potentials if we have the right partnerships with government and otherwise to build substantially more. But it does go back to what both Claire and Thom has as a, internally organizing ourselves, but also being matched in a real partnership with government, whether federal, provincial, or municipal, that really makes this happen.
Thank you for adding that context, Simone. I have another question here. I'm going to put two together because I know there's one a little further down that maybe should be joined to this. Someone further down was asking, can someone please explain what a community land trust is? And then also I'll add it to this question and turn it into a couple-parter, which is, how can new CLTs find the capital to acquire land when they don't have existing assets to leverage, and especially when real estate prices are so high?
So I might jump in on the community land trust aspect. And I think the Vancouver Land Trust also has a little bit of a difference than the one that I'm familiar with, which is the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. So the community land trust is this idea of a community-driven governance vehicle that can hold ownership of assets. And then with an operating partner, so say, for example, a co-op might be an operating partner, or it might be a social housing provider, then provide affordable housing to a community. So the land trust doesn't operate the property. So it doesn't, necessarily collect the rents or the member charges. It doesn't provide supportive housing or services. What it does is it just holds the asset itself and thinks about how to leverage that asset for growth, or just to maintain the asset, the structural integrity of that asset. The community aspect with the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is, within our governance, we have a tripartite board. So that means that there's a space, there are designated seats on the board for members of the community, for people who are users of the assets. So that could be a resident, or the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. Our first acquisition was a community garden. So people who use the community garden would have a designated seat on the board, and then also a seat for more members at large. And so those might be people who bring technical expertise to our board. And so there's a real commitment when you have a governance structure that has that variety of users, not just to maintaining the asset, but also the community engagement and championing the cause of the land trust. So I'll throw it over to Thom maybe to talk about the Vancouver Land Trust model.
Yeah, they're, at their root, they're very similar. I mean, a community land trust, it's just a nonprofit association created to acquire, preserve, hold, and develop land. Now, it doesn't have to be housing, right? I mean, the biggest land trust in Canada that I'm aware of is Ducks Unlimited. So there's habitat preservation, arts and culture, heritage preservation. We're focused on housing. But the idea is to create a vehicle for, again, aggregating assets and stewarding those assets over time. Claire, you mentioned asset management in your remarks, and I didn't, but it's a very, very important aspect of this, because one of the knocks against the co-op housing model, Simone, you described it as fragile, and indeed in some cases it is, where there's not either sufficient attention or expertise to handle long-term asset management or stewardship, and that's a function that can be delegated to a land trust with a staff who can handle that and leave members to what they do best, which is create and foster community and inclusion. And that's something that we've been working really hard to get the right balance on in BC. So that's where, at its root, the model is the same, but there are significant variations on how they're governed and managed. And that's what I love about the model, right? Because it's so flexible and adaptable to different community priorities and contexts. We love learning from what's happening in Parkdale and Kensington, and the work that's going on in the Circle Community Land Trust in Toronto. There's just such innovation out there, and it all comes down to that root. You pool your autonomy, you aggregate your assets, and you move forward on an aligned mission that delivers outcomes for everybody who's part of the venture.
Thank you, Thom. Simone, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's I'm good. Sorry.
Good. Just wanted to check. I have another question in the chat that is, how are cost escalations in operating expenses and major capital projects managed and mitigated in nonprofit cooperatives?
I'd love to talk about the experience of the Dufferin Grove Housing Cooperative. So we are a co-op of 10 properties in Parkdale, in the downtown west area of Toronto. And we have major capital repairs. So we are a co-op it's one of the first co-ops that were developed in Canada. And they acquired existing properties. So our buildings are over 100 years old and are in need of significant repairs, and our capital costs are significant. We also have had the experience of varying degrees of expertise, capacity, and attention, I think was what Thom said, from our board. And so our balance sheets and our books have not always looked great. And so when we approach the end of mortgages and are thinking about our properties, we weren't in the best position to deal with all of the capital repairs that we had, because we hadn't been paying attention to them over the years. We didn't have the expertise. And when we did have that expertise, it was only for the term that board member would have been on the board, and then they're off the board. And so there's this way in which co-op boards can have challenges with that. That led our membership to come to an agreement to make the decision to sell one of our properties. And this was just, last year. And that felt very much like a decision that was made because people felt so scared about their home situations. And so I think there's this real opportunity that exists for us to manage our properties a little bit more effectively, and also have more space available to think about building community and building relationships and dealing with the conflicts that inevitably arise in community, and having that asset management really being taken on by experts. So just one story about how one co-op managed their assets.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in from there. Co-op housing history has come from a lot of different places across the country, but one of the early ideas that was a lesson learned that I think we learned painfully a long time is, some co-ops originally, the idea was they managed themselves, like literally the people who lived there were doing the maintenance, and that was not a recipe for success. But that was one of the early ideas of how to keep the costs down, and what you learn from experiences, that does not keep costs down at all. So we've seen a change, and you've seen co-ops move more and more to professional management. Very few in Ontario volunteer run co-ops still exist, and those that do tend to be very small. But that again speaks to what Claire mentioned of the scale. But also, we often get the question, and I've scrolled down and I've seen it, do we do co-ownership housing or co-housing? And the answer really from CHF Canada is no. Where we've seen housing co-op success is when there has been scale, and we've been able to leverage that scale to operate more efficiently, to be more sustainable over the long term, to also not wear down the people. If you're in a housing co-op, you need to be on the board of directors. You need to make serious decisions, as Claire alluded to the health and long-term sustainability of that community, and ideally of building more affordable housing and being part of that success. And in a very small housing co-op, that can really wear on folks if you're talking about 30 years, if you're talking about 50 years. So that's the direction that we want to go. But certainly this moment now, cost escalation is concerning, and I think everybody is looking at construction prices and everything else. But you know, I think as a sector, we also have remarkable savings, and I'll say that because every dollar goes back into the operations of the community versus what you see in private rental, and that's how we're able to manage affordability over the long term. Maybe I'll stop there.
I think it's the 7 generations thinking is something that often comes to mind for me. Like if I think about like Indigenous knowledge that has been really beneficial in this co-op sector, is that 7 generations thinking is just so important. Is how do we enable ourselves to think beyond our own generation and our own homes as co-op members? And I think that can, you know, provide a lot of insight for us, or guidance.
Any thoughts on that question, Thom? Cool, thank you. I have another question here, maybe an interesting jumping off point from the last one. What does it mean for co-op members if the housing providers opt out of the agreement when the mortgages wrap up?
Okay, so in Ontario, for these co-ops that the mortgages are ending, that kind of end of mortgage issue, the answer is unknown. So the province is, like as I mentioned, at this moment, or forthcoming, they've just finished their public consultation, writing the regulations that will dictate this new environment for when the mortgages end. So they have said in the latest bill, Bill 184, Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act, that there will be new agreements either between the service manager and the housing provider, or there'll be what are called exit agreements. But the rules around those new agreements, whether there will be a baseline funding formula, which is what we really want to see included, a baseline funding formula that includes rental assistance, whether that's going to be written into the regulation is yet to be seen. And also, what are the terms for an exit agreement? So very well may be that households in a co-op or a nonprofit that should go through an exit agreement. You know, there could be any number of stipulations in the regulation about what happens to them. The real answer is we don't know at this point. But I would say that it is vitally important that the province lets everyone know what's going to happen soon, as there are 21,000 people living in the housing co-ops in Ontario that don't know what that future will be, and 80,000 people in nonprofits and co-ops. So we really are urging the province to move forward with this, with the regulations.
Great answer. I think it's good to think about the fact that that's coming together maybe. I think I have another question here. Are there any Canadian initiatives to support the creation of cooperative manufactured home communities, or any specialized resources to assist those that already exist?
So I'm not quite sure about the manufactured homes communities. I don't know if we're talking about prefab homes there, so I apologize. If that is the case, there's no one specific for housing co-ops yet, but I am aware of a number of nonprofits that are working with some companies in that space, and it is certainly an interesting space that I think there will be co-ops looking at it in the future if we do get to see new development at scale.
Great. Maybe returning to some of the darkness that we began with a little bit. Well, I see a comment and question here. While I appreciate the optimism, I'm also wondering, what is the worst case scenario for an individual co-op? Could members potentially lose their housing?
So for the end of mortgage, the current act is a bit different than the end of operating situation that some folks might be familiar with. If you were living in a federal housing co-op, there was a real potential that rental assistance was going to end, and that would mean that an individual might lose the funding they need to afford their home. For the worst case scenario for the end of mortgage, co-ops currently are legislated to that they must, and mandated that they must provide rent geared to income assistance to the 75% of households that need it, that come from the municipal social housing waitlist in our co-ops. So they may not lose their home, they won't lose the funding for the rental assistance they need, but what we were very concerned about seeing is that these homes will very quickly degrade. These are at minimum 35-year-old co-ops we're talking about. They were many of them were acquisition rehab programs, co-ops, so the buildings are 50 years, or like Claire's 100-year-old buildings. And they need a lot of repair and renewal because the existing funding formula hasn't allowed for the funding to do that. So, we are concerned about the risk of loss of co-op units and co-op communities if this is not resolved. That these homes actually could be at risk, and they could be either become uninhabitable. That would be the long-term, very scary risk. Or that the co-op may just cease to operate as a co-op and give it back to the municipality, and so you have to deal with it because the funding formula is quite simply not viable.
I see two questions a little further down that I think might be a good complement to the one that we just spoke to, which is, I see in the chat, if I understand correctly, Simone said that co-ops are jointly owned by members. Does this mean that members have equity in the co-op in which they live? And then the next comment, just one further down, is another term that would be helpful to clarify this is the difference between nonprofit and equity co-ops, which we mentioned early on in the conversation earlier. Maybe we can speak to these differences now.
Sure. So in Ontario, and I'll preface this, and I almost never do that, but because Tom's sitting here, it's slightly different in BC. So in Ontario, members do not have any equity in the housing co-op. So there's no, in many ways, it's quite similar to rental. On move-in, you might do a damage deposit, and first month we call it a housing charge instead of rent. But you have no equity in co-op, but you have the right as a member to live there as long as you may upheld the obligations of a member. So, you know, that you pay your housing charges on time, that you are a good member of the community, you don't harm anybody else's right to their housing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no equity, but they are jointly owned. So basically, if you're in a member of the co-op, it's almost like you are entrusted with the co-op as an entity. And so that's the sense of that ownership, is that you have that decision-making role for that organization. And, you know, even you have the right to be on that board of directors and make the detailed decisions, but even as a standard member, it's one member, one vote. You know, as we've kind of alluded to before, you're setting the budget for the co-op. You're setting the long-term vision of the co-op. That's the kind of the sense of the ownership that you have there. So hopefully that answers that question. And so equity co-op, sorry, maybe that was the other half of that question that I didn't address. My apologies. So equity co-ops, there are co-ops that are more like an ownership model. So it's similar to a condo structure in Ontario, but instead of owning the exact unit, you own a stake kind of in the overall building. And I apologize, I'm not an expert in this space, but if anybody else wants to chime in on equity co-ops,
it is a little different in BC, and in a way that makes it easier to explain, because in BC you don't pay like a deposit. You actually buy a share or shares in a co-op. Now, in a nonprofit co-op, those are par value membership shares. They're not investment shares. So you might buy in at $2,500, and that's what you get back when you move out. And none of the assets of the co-op are distributed to the members if the co-op winds up or dissolves. So that's a nonprofit model. In an equity co-op model, and there aren't that many of them frankly, because they got kind of shouldered to the side by the strata model when stratas were introduced into BC. That's what we call condos. And there the share can appreciate. So you might buy in at the same $2,500, but if the market, the value of the co-op increases over time, when a new member, it's time for you to move out and a new member to move in, you can redeem the share and sell it to the new member for market value or whatever it's appreciated over time. So maybe that $2,500 equity share is now worth $5,500. So it's a very challenging model because banks and credit unions hate lending against it because it's not dirt, right? It's not real property. It's a piece of paper. It's a share certificate. It's mortgageable. Well, it's not mortgageable the way the banks look at it, and it's more like a commercial loan. There are also apartment corporations that sprung up in BC in the 50s and 60s before there was a Strata Act or Co-op Act, where people would literally incorporate a business corporation. They would own shares in the business, and the business would buy a purpose-built rental building, and the shareholders would occupy it as members or as shareholders of the company. They tend to call themselves co-ops, which creates no end of confusion around, because they're not incorporated under the Co-op Act, but they do function in governance in many respects like co-ops, and they do share some of the community characteristics of co-ops. It's a combination now of not just a home that's permanently affordable for everyone. It's a home and an investment. So not a big part of the Canadian co-op housing landscape, but huge in Europe, the Scandinavian countries, and in various countries around the world. The equity co-op model has actually outstripped the nonprofit or rental co-op model.
Interesting. I'm gonna jump back a little bit in the chat, and this is maybe a little bit of a leap from what we were just discussing, but I think it's an interesting question, and I want to try and deal with them in order. But can you talk to how, or can anyone maybe speak to how building new affordable housing can respond to the climate emergency? So potentially building better technology, medium density, walkable communities, reducing car dependency, and how cooperatives might play a role in this.
Yeah, that pushes, I'll be brief, and that pushes one of my buttons, because the short answer is yes, they're ideally suited to that, but governments, well, I'll just talk about the federal and the BC governments have stubbornly resisted the need to recognize that sometimes the upfront capital cost of building those features into new supply is higher. There are enormous downstream savings and benefits to the environment, but the initial cost can be higher, and that's not taken into account in so many of the funding formulas that are baked into the co-op and nonprofit housing programs around, and that's going to be a problem, because the construction industry is very conservative, not just in its financial model, but in embracing new technologies and new ways to reduce carbon footprint. Mass timber construction being another example of that in BC. So yeah, there's enormous potential there, but the need, it has to be reflected fairly and accurately in the funding models that are available, or it just won't get taken up.
Any other takers there?
I think just that for most people as renters, the idea of like doing an energy retrofit to your rental is just, that doesn't make any sense. But when you think about that as a member of a co-op, it does make a lot of sense that you would have that type of direction that you provide to your housing. And I think in addition to that, as co-ops, we can access things like longer amortization periods, which help with that issue of the higher upfront capital costs and making it affordable over the long term. So being able to access longer amortization periods, and also just being able to imagine that as somebody who's not thinking about home ownership, I think is a nice aspect too.
I like that addition. I see a question specifically directed at Thom, but maybe we can all speak to it a little bit. You mentioned that an important development has been the recent growth of development capacity in the co-op housing and nonprofit housing sector. Could you expand on why this is important and point to the kinds of policies that could help to strengthen this development capacity across the country?
Well, I think the good news is that CMHC is doing that by seeding the development and emergence of a host of new community land trusts across the country. I was really pleased to see that in a recent funding announcement, because that's where I think the biggest potential lies. It's in developing that social purpose real estate development expertise in vehicles controlled by the sector, and not just the co-op housing sector, but in partnership with the nonprofit housing sector. And that's where I think we have to focus our energy. I think my colleagues on the panel did a really good job of describing where we can run into limits to our capacity, and we just can't accept those limits as part of the co-op landscape. We have to move beyond them and bake that capacity into our various structures.
I would add also that as people who care about housing, which I think is everyone on this call, learning some of the skills like how to build a pro forma, understanding spreadsheets a little bit, and starting to learn about construction management, and those are as important to the movement as anything else. And I think the experience of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, where we didn't have a lot of that capacity, and that capacity was developed in-house through our executive director, Joshua Barnt, but also just this idea that it is possible, it's not out of reach, we can do it. And we usually come to it from a perspective that is much more affordable than if we're hiring consultants. So I would put it out to the people on this call that those types of skill sets are highly valuable and can make a huge impact in your communities.
Thank you for that. I have a question. I have two questions that I'm going to turn into one question, or a two-parter, I guess. I see in the chat, are there tools available to raise funds in order to fund a land trust to acquire land? And then lower down, I see would the CLT concept that Claire and Thom have proposed involve the CLT taking ownership of current co-op buildings, taking a more hands-on role in maintaining the property long-term? If so, what would the path be to get there from the current situation where many Toronto co-ops own
So I'll jump into the latter question, because that puts explicitly what I've been talking about. And I think it's something that is a bit hard to digest for a lot of co-op members, is that giving up their ownership to a land trust could be a more abundant and more fruitful and generate a really exciting new era of cooperative housing. I think for new members, the big opportunity is that their capacity to take care of their existing buildings and to see the quality of their own homes improve is part and parcel of a process of growth. We have to nourish our existing foundations in the soil that we started from in order to grow. And I don't think that giving up ownership to a land trust changes that, but it is a bit of a difficult sell for many co-op members. But yes, that is, for me, that is the idea, but there are definitely other types of partnership. There's creative ways that we could think about partnership with land trusts that might not require explicitly a transfer of ownership, but that would be the cleanest way and enable the land trust to then do a lot more leveraging because they can asset that effectively with financiers like banks and credit unions.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I would maybe add, I think it's not a matter of every co-op is always going to need to do this or want to do this, be the right co-op to do this, but that where we have so many, I think there's, and particularly in certain regions, this, it's a really exciting opportunity. And I think that's what Claire and Thom are kind of really speaking to. There are some co-ops that also have just been able to go out and develop on their own. But it's, as a wide sector, what is the best path forward? And I think Claire really hit the nail on the butt. It has to work for the existing members. It has to give to work for them. Otherwise, why would they join if it's just giving up control? But I think that greater vision, it would lead a lot of people there, and that opportunity to renew, redevelop, and build back better.
Yeah. One tangible example is in Parkdale, we've got, I believe, 3 or 4 co-ops. So we've got the Dufferin Grove Housing Co-op, we've got the John Bruce Co-op, we've got a provincial co-op, which is the Spencer Co-op. I think it's in the CHFT Land Trust. And then we've got a Howard Park Co-op. And so what would be the opportunities for those co-ops to work together, especially if we think about the City of Toronto having lands at Masrick Cowan, which is right in the heart of Parkdale, where they're thinking about development. If we as co-ops came together to partner, can we increase the density? Can we increase what the city is imagining with that space by leveraging our equity and our assets and saying we can be an operating partner and take this to the next level? Because the city can do so much in terms of providing the land and some support, but can we add value to that in addition? And I think that's like a really tangible example of what could be possible.
I want to be cognizant of time. We have a little under 10 minutes left in our time allotted for the seminar. I want to try and get to as many questions as possible. I'm going to try and tack another question onto this one, which is, according to your experience, is there a specific building type that might work better than others for co-op projects? For example, like mid-rise over high-rise buildings. And then circling back to our earlier comment, someone had mentioned that manufactured homes, as mentioned in the question earlier, is sort of mobile homes or trailer parks. And there was a mention below of Canadian REITs buying them up. So maybe the question could be like, are CLTs co-ops a good intervention in the case of mobile homes as well?
Potentially. But I can tell you that the value of the land is often a real impediment there. There are housing nonprofit housing co-ops organized as manufactured home parks in BC. Not that many of them, but there are many more owned by private operators who've had them for literally decades. And of course, in an overheated real estate market, the value of the property underlying all those homes is worth far more than the homes ever will be. So private operators and owners are starting to sell them off, and we've looked on many occasions at the economics of purchasing them and then operating them on a nonprofit or cooperative basis, and the challenge always turns out to be that the debt service that gets created by the price of the land can't be served or amortized with the kinds of rental or pad fees that the manufactured home owners can afford to pay. So it's a very, very challenging niche in the housing market. The BC government has been approached on more than one occasion by associations of manufactured home tenants to try and do something about that, to create a bit of a capital or subsidy program to make it more feasible to buy those parks. But it's very, very challenging. And on the built form question, it's just site specific and number specific. You often don't have a choice because you get to a certain height, you have to move then from wood frame to concrete, and that just blows your pro forma out of the water. So sometimes the what might strike you as an ideal building form for a certain type of community, while you're still at the penciling it out stage, turns out to be unaffordable, especially given concrete prices out west.
I'm going to jump in with a question. Is there a future for small volunteer co-ops funded through community bonds to buy land for building co-ops? I have another question maybe attached to that. how, like, have any co-op projects utilize CMHC funding? What does that look like?
So in Ontario, some have certainly utilized different programs. It's not an easy fit, I would say, some of the current CMHC programs under the National Housing Strategy. So we are certainly hopeful and trying to work with the government to make better programs that fit better for housing co-ops. And I would say the nonprofit sector has equally found that some of the current programs under the National Housing Strategy just have not led to the types of housing that we want to see, out of the affordability levels or the scale of new nonprofit and co-op development. So that on that question, certainly it's worked, but it's not been a great fit, and we are hoping to see it better. On the small volunteer-run co-ops funded through community bonds to buy land and building codes, we certainly haven't seen much of that in Ontario, and certainly in recent years, or not, I would say, incorporated as a nonprofit housing co-op. So there may in fact be some folks who are trying to operate in that space within equity co-ops, but I think that the structure in Ontario don't lend itself well to that. And I'm not aware of many. There are some folks that are incorporated as co-ops, but the end product is not a housing co-op. So for example, folks might be familiar with Options for Homes. I believe they were originally incorporated, may still be incorporated as a co-op, the organization itself, but what they build is affordable ownership housing, and they leverage different types of funding to make that possible.
Just on the small volunteer-led community bonds can be very tricky to structure as a financial product in a way that it's actually going to be beneficial as a form of financing your project. And so sometimes it's better to just go to a bank if you can go to a bank, because from a cost benefit perspective, it's just not that great of a product, especially at those small scales. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, we get contacted as well from time to time by people interested in that idea. And it almost always turns out to be the case that they're better off self-financing, because in order to, secure, well, you just need to build at a certain density in order to create a viable development proposal, and that's not easy to do on a much smaller scale.
We only have 2 minutes left. I'm gonna end us on I know there's so much happening in the chat right now, and there's a lot of conversation there, so maybe folks can individually type in responses to lower questions, but I want to end us on this question. So, and I expect this might be relevant to a lot of people in attendance tonight. If we are not a tenant or a member in a co-op, how can people help to organize? What might people do to support cooperative development?
I would say if you're in Toronto, maybe start a campaign to get CHFT to open its membership to non-resident members of, to non-resident members. So create a membership class, either, ask a board of directors to do that at a local co-op or CHFT, and even CHF Canada, Simone, maybe. But open up a membership class that is for people who are not residents, and help them to bring their voices to the table.
What I would add to that, if you are not a member right now, is to speak up. So this past federal election, CHF Canada joined with a number of other organizations, including the Canadian, just for CAEH, they're the organization to end homelessness, the association, to end homelessness in Canada. We also partnered with the CHRA, which is the Canadian Housing Renewal Association, and the Lived Experience Network, and we ran a campaign called Vote Housing. And that campaign gathered over 18,000 supporters. 90,000 emails were sent to candidates in the federal election. It became a real voice for those who are interested in building housing and cooperative housing in Canada to influence last election. And that really takes, that really isn't very important because when they hear from associations like myself, they hear it from Thom, you know, we have a vested interest in the sport of cooperative housing, but they need to hear from people that this is a real priority because as Thom mentioned, housing is expensive. You know, building affordable housing, we know the importance of it to our communities. We know the value of cooperative housing, but it takes that level of government commitment as well. And that will only happen if they hear from people that this is a priority for them. So whether if it's your local city councillor, your MPP or MP, letting them know that you care, and you can certainly go on to Vote Housing still and speak up for co-op housing, and we're doing work for the federal budget, and there will be a campaign in Ontario for the upcoming provincial election as well.
And this week, there's a golden opportunity when CHF Canada releases its proposal, building the next generation of co-op housing. That's a golden opportunity to plug into the CHF Canada effort and impress on elected officials at all levels that that's exactly what we ought to be doing. There's no better way for government to invest in community-based, community-owned housing than in the cooperative housing.
Thank you all. Oh, go ahead.
I'll say, so if you want to see that submission, follow us on Twitter at CHF Canada.
Fantastic. So we have run out of time. I know this has been a really exciting conversation, and a lot of people are really excited about this in the chat. Hopefully we can keep it rolling. But we don't have any more time tonight. So I'm going to wrap us up. I do really want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. This has been a really great, a great panel. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. I really want to thank our guests, our expert panel, for coming and sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. And I will also wrap up by saying, please stay tuned to the Affordable Housing Challenge's work and our projects coming up over the next couple of months. We do continue with our monthly seminar series. This happens every month. And you can follow us on Twitter for updates. Like was just mentioned, anyone who wants to put their handle in the chat, please do. But this is ours. I've just posted it at the bottom. So you can keep track of us there for future events and ongoing work. And thank you, yes, so much for everyone attending tonight. It was wonderful to have such a huge audience for this event to come hear about this. And I wish everyone a good night.